Hey everybody, DCB here again. So about 6 or 7 years ago, I was starting to get into 3D modeling, and eventually I knew I wanted to also get into 3D printing. But at that time, the printers weren't quite up to what I wanted them to be, and the prices were still a little too high. I knew that was going to change soon, so I sort of held off until it felt right for me. But in the meantime, I wanted to teach myself how to do CAD modeling and 3D sculpting since I don't like to just, download other people's work. And I had like 1.5 million projects in my head that I wanted to do. So I taught myself how to use Fusion by starting out with something relatively simple, and that was the Fisher Price Play Family dog, since he was geometrically dimensional and I could measure and map him out that way. I figured out the ears and the collar and the body pretty quickly, and the head was a little tricky, but I soon figured that out as well. I started to get a little confused when I had to put his face on, but I eventually got that to work as well, and he turned out not all that bad. Um, I eventually bought my own printer then, and this little two upscale dog was the first thing I printed. I held on to this print as a nice reminder of my beginnings into this 3D modeling world. It's not the best print by today's standards, but it's not that bad. Uh, but I wasn't satisfied with just this two up version, and I decided to go bigger and enlarge him to 8 times the size. That's where the name of my website comes from, times8.biz, because I was going to enlarge everything I had to 8 times size. I'm not sure why I initially picked that scale, though. It might have just been because that was the biggest I could do on the printer I had at the time. I don't know. I eventually abandoned that scale, but the website still has the name. I'll change it eventually, but I just don't feel like doing that right now. But anyway, I made a handful of these 8 times scale Fisher Price dogs, and then the bully, and then the third piece was Bert. I never got around to doing Ernie, though, as these proved to be such a pain in the butt to make at this size with the big molds, and the cost just to ship them was like $100. So I did sell a few of them, but at that price point, it was a very limited client pool. So then I opted for doing them a little bit smaller size at 3.5 times scale. And I made these banks. I made the dog and the bully. Those are a pretty big hit, and I still get people asking me if I'll ever do another run of them. Maybe, but that's what I always say, maybe. But honestly, I rarely like to revisit past projects. But around the time I was doing the big 8X ones, I thought about also making a car to go with them. And I actually did print out a huge car, but it was just so big and cumbersome. And I also wanted it to be radio controlled, but that just proved to be a little too difficult and expensive to do at that size. So I chucked the whole thing in the trash and decided to scale it down to the smaller 3.5 times size. So the first thing I did was bought an inexpensive radio controlled car off of Amazon that I could use some of the circuitry and the gears and stuff and sort of retrofit everything else off of the parts to get it to work, to my specific car design. I got pretty far with that, but then I set it aside to, work on other stuff, which I do a lot, and I sort of forgot about it. But then I came across this video the other day from Punished Props where he repurposed an existing radio controlled car into some cartoon robot car guy from Futurama or something. I don't know. I really liked some of the methods he did, especially how he designed the wheels and the tires with this two-step, two-material casting process. And I couldn't stop thinking about that, and it really intrigued me to try that out. And his whole video series just put a fire in me to dig out my RC car files and see where I left off and maybe revisit that project. So I went back on Amazon to make sure that I could still get the radio controlled car that I originally modeled everything off of, but discovered that it was no longer being sold. So I started searching through all the other RC cars in that general price range until I found one that looked pretty similar to the previous one I had. I would assume it'd have a lot of the same parts inside, but I wanted to make sure, so I ordered it. But then when it arrived and I took it apart, I discovered that it was a completely different design, similar but different. Different enough to the point where I had to redesign everything. So that's what I ended up doing. But that's okay though, because sometimes it's, good to start over from scratch so you can, improve on things that may have been kind of iffy in the previous version. Plus, my skills have improved, even more over the past 2 years or so when I first started this idea. So I have most of the steering mechanisms on this new version figured out, and the battery and the circuit placement and everything. It's a very tight squeeze to get everything into the car because there's only a little bit of space up front and in the back because of how the seat of the car, takes up the entire center of it. But I managed to get everything squeezed in there, in digital theory at least. I still have to model out the motor in the back of the car, but I'm pretty confident that will fit because there is still a lot of room back there. And then for the remote, the original RC car just had this ugly trigger handle style remote, which looks way too modern and not very Fisher pricey. So I took inspiration from a vintage Fisher Price pocket radio for my remote. I thought it would be kind of a fun nod to those. So I've been modeling a completely new design based off of those radios, but in a way that can accommodate a steering wheel and the speed control and the on-off switches and everything. It's kind of an unusual layout in the original trigger handle that I have to kind of fit into this completely different shape. So I had to come up with a few different rods and levers, to make that work. Could I just make a new circuit board for it? Maybe. I don't know, but it just seems like a lot of work when I have an existing one right here out of the car. I got most of the inner guts designed right now, just a couple more little tweaks, and then I can prototype that out and see if it actually works. But for now, I'm just going to work on making some of the dogs. Like I said, this is the same size and scale of the banks that I made a while ago, but I wanted to have a completely new dog to go with this set. I wanted him to be, in 4 pieces like the original toy, the ears, the head, the collar, and the body. So I made 4 separate molds. The first one is for the ears. It's just a 2-part pour mold where the resin will go right down the center shaft here, and then I put these channels on the side to let the air, escape out the top to make sure it gets into all the spots. I'm casting these in smooth-on black onyx resin, which is a nice solid black resin. I like to use that for black items whenever possible, so I don't have to paint it. It kicks pretty fast though, so they make a slower version, which takes a couple hours to cure, but this one kicks in just a few minutes. So you got to be really quick with it. I can just about get it into the mold and into the pressure pot before it starts to kick in. And then after a few minutes, I can remove it here and see what I got. The air vents did a really perfect job of getting all the resin everywhere, and they just break off here. And there's a little bit of flashing that I can scrape off and work a little bit with a blade. So that's the ears. Pretty easy. And then the head is another 2-part mold. I'm going to rotocast that, as that's my preferred method of casting. I'm using Smoothcast 65D, which is specially formulated to be, best for rotocasting, but it can be used for regular pour casting as well. It cures to a bright white, and even though I need the parts to be white, I like to paint my molds anyway, because the resin on its own doesn't hold paint very well, and I still have to paint on his face. So I'm going to spray the mold with a flat white Rust-Oleum paint. With this technique, you don't need any mold release. And then the paint actually kind of embeds with the resin and gives it a perfectly primed surface to paint on. And the paint doesn't scratch off like it does, if I was just to paint the raw resin. I I absolutely love this method, and I wish I had thought of it years ago because it's really saved me. So I'm just using 60 milliliters of resin here, and 10 minutes on the roto and another 30 minutes or so, and it's ready to come out of the mold. I use a little bit of compressed air to kind of loosen it from the mold, and then I just slowly work it out. For the collar, I didn't want to use paint. I wanted that to be an actual tinted resin. So I'm using Smooth On Ignite Fluorescent Red pigment in Smoothcast 60D, which is kind of a semi-transparent resin. I mixed up a batch of pre-tinted B-side into a separate bottle here so that all my castings will have a consistent tinting to them rather than, tinting each time I cast one. So 40 mils of resin here, and then again, I'll rotocast it. I like rotocasting a lot better than pour casting because you don't have to worry about putting air vents into the mold or anything, and it uses less resin, but it also just makes for a nicer casting with fewer air bubbles or mistakes. So whenever I can, I'll always rotocast a piece, even if it's something as small as this. For the body, because it's black, I would like to use the onyx resin for it, but you can't really rotocast that resin since it kicks in so fast. I've tried it before and it just doesn't work that great. So instead, I'm going to just paint the mold with a flat black paint and then use the 65D again to cast it. I'm going to first pour about 20 mil into the bottom section of the body here, just so it has a nice solid area, kind of like a weighted spot on the bottom so that he stands up better. And then after that's cured, I'll put in 100 mils more of resin and then rotocast that. And again, after about 30 minutes or so, it's ready to come out of the mold. I like to give it enough time to cure to make sure I don't warp or damage it pulling it out of the mold. So that's the body. And then they all just fit together like this. I'll glue everything after I clean up all the parts. But for the face, I designed this stencil that just, snaps right on the head here. And then I can just give it a couple squirts of black paint and then pop that off and call it good. It's a lot quicker and easier and nicer looking than if I had to hand paint everything, for sure. So there's the dog. I'll start finishing up the remote next because I'm mostly done designing that. I have a feeling there will be many prototypes made just to make sure everything is working properly. So it might be a while, maybe like a month or so before I post a video about that. And then I'll do a third video of the car and then a special surprise fourth one. It should all be pretty fun. I'm excited to finally see this project being finished as it's something I've wanted to do now for, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years. So that's about it for now. Be sure to check out Punished Props RC conversion video series. Link is in the description. He's a good guy, very easy to follow, user-friendly tutorials. His car is pretty elaborate and intricate. Mine won't be that fancy, but I'm also doing multiple copies instead of his, just one off that he did. So it's different in that respect. But that's about all for this one. Be sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell so when I release part 2, 3, and 4, you'll know. Wow, I don't think I've ever said those words before in my videos. I feel all grown up or dirty or something. I don't know which. But anyway, thanks everyone. Bye.
Darn, that's the end.
Thanks everyone for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe to this channel and follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Dustin Cropsboy. Also check out our TeePublic page for t-shirts you can buy to help support this channel, or just go to the website dcbvarietyhour.com for all the links.